Welcome to the Regulation Podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Marcial Boo, Chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. On last month's podcast, we heard from Groningen Moss, the Chief Executive of the world's first Ministry for Regulation in New Zealand. And this month, we're delighted to host another international guest to talk about regulatory developments in his country. Professor Cary Coglianese is an American legal scholar who's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where he is also Director of the Penn Program on Regulation. He's written widely and successfully on regulatory issues, including a 2016 work called Achieving Regulatory Excellence, and he's founded the Regulatory Review, which is a regular source of regulatory news, analysis and opinion. So, Cary, you're the perfect guest for the Regulation Podcast here in the UK, which aspires to do the same as you're doing in Pennsylvania. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure to be with you.
It's great to have you. Thanks very much, Cary. Now, I said that you lead a program on regulation in Pennsylvania. So just start off by telling us a little bit about that work and your own research interest in regulation.
Sure. Well, I've been doing research on regulation now throughout my entire career now, going back almost 40 years now. And the Penn Program on Regulation dates back to my joining the University of Pennsylvania, coming here from Harvard University back now almost 20 years ago now. The Penn Program on Regulation is an academic program in the sense that it's centered here at the university, and it draws together about 60 different faculty from across the university, not just at the law school where my primary appointment is, but also the Wharton School, the School of Engineering, and Medical School, and other schools around campus. And we put out our research. That's an important part of what we do. Working papers, articles, books, all about regulation or regulatory issues. But we have two other things that we do. One is teaching, and that's certainly teaching in the traditional university sense for degree program students. But we also have executive education programs that have been very popular, and we've done those on a general enrollment basis for regulators around the world, but also on a custom basis where we design courses for specific regulators, again, around the world. And then the in addition to the research and the teaching, I guess I'd say the third leg of our stool is outreach. And we're all about wanting to make an impact, a positive impact on the world. It doesn't do any good to do research or teaching if it doesn't really reach out and make a difference. So you mentioned the Regulatory Review. That's our flagship publication, and we are producing new content on that online publication every single business day, and have been doing that for 15 years now. And we have an audience of readers from over 185 different countries. So we're very busy. Lots of activity. Conferences, workshops, seminars, and engagement with the world at large. It's really in keeping with an ethos at the University of Pennsylvania. We were a university founded by Benjamin Franklin, who was really a person
Polymath,
who was an incredibly brilliant person, but also very much applied and thinking about how knowledge can be used to make the world a better place.
Yeah, amazing. And that third leg of your stool is exactly what we here at the Institute of Regulation are trying to do, which is to connect people who are interested in regulatory issues, academics, and of course mostly practitioners, so that we can do the job better. And I was particularly interested in the breadth of the scope of the different expertise academic expertise that you draw in, because obviously regulation touches on every sector of the economy.
Yeah, and I think, for most people in the world of practice and in the world of academe, when they're working on regulatory issues, we tend to see people get caught up in silos. And that's in some ways understandable, because the technical knowledge and issues are very complex that regulators deal with. And so just coming up on the learning curve on those issues is really difficult. But B, also often the legal and regulatory structures are themselves complex, and learning those and coming up on the learning curve is challenging. And yet, despite the fact that I think the regulatory world on both the research side and in the world of practice can be siloed, I have found over the years, and this goes back even to my time at Harvard, where I founded the regulatory policy program there, that there's so many commonalities that cut across different regulatory issues, and a lot of learning that can take place between regulators, even though they're dealing with different kinds of issues. So among our faculty here at Penn and among our various programs and the like, we are, dealing everything from, I guess you'd say, A to Z, artificial intelligence to, zoology.
Absolutely. Well, we've had a podcast here talking about the regulation of vets and the regulation of food at Christmas, because all of these share many of these same issues of compliance, of law enforcement, of communication, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the management challenges are very similar for regulators. There's an asymmetry between regulatory success and regulatory failure that exists across every domain, right? So when regulation is succeeding, no one thinks about it. Planes
Absolutely.
are taking off safely. Banks are not collapsing.
Exactly. We're breathing
buildings
air,
are literally not
eating.
collapsing. Right.
Exactly.
We're eating, we're not getting sick and so forth. But when, regulatory failures occur, they're often very visible. And so that, I like to sort of say that, regulatory excellence is like the Greek word arete, actually, which goes back to ancient Greece, and it means excellence. But today, arete is a word that's used by mountain climbers, actually. That's really the modern use of that word. And it refers to the knife's edge of a mountain ridge.
Right.
And I think regulators are always kind of traversing on that kind of a knife's edge. And one false step and they can see a big failure. So,
well, I mean, we've all experienced those of us who are practitioners, and I've personally wobbled on that cliff edge. So we've talked already about there's how much there is in common across our jurisdictions. Us in the UK, yourselves over there in the States. But before we come into some of the developments that are taking place in regulation in the United States, maybe you can just help us here in the UK to understand a little bit about the background to the US regulatory system, because it may be slightly different in terms of the federal structure of the country and so on and so forth. So just give us a little insight into how regulation works in general in the States.
Sure. Well, as you said, we are a federal structure, so we have states and we have a national government. And some domains of regulation are almost exclusively state-focused, regulation of schools or of roadways. In fact, in our history, the whole regulatory authority for promoting the public welfare resided at the state level. But after seeing that just having a group of 13 states wasn't working so well, we formed a constitution where the states gave power to a national government. And that constitution, which still articulates the framework of our government, has the national government having authority to regulate interstate commerce. But that means largely now almost anything, because we are in a connected country, and there's also abilities for the national government to put in place standards for states on things like even roadways when there are federal dollars being spent to help support the building and construction of those roadways. So we have still a tradition of state primacy, but in practice, really, there's a lot of federal oversight. And the federal law, when it conflicts with state laws, will supersede it.
Okay.
I should say that there's also a lot of areas where there's what we sometimes call cooperative federalism, where both the national government is adopting standards and then the states are. Let me just say a word about the national level. Yeah. We've got hundreds of regulatory agencies that run, again, the gamut from transportation to workplace safety to banking, solvency, and so forth. Even though, by the way, we also have state banking regulators, for example, and so forth.
Complex picture.
It's a very complex regulatory system. At the federal level, these cabinet departments and sub-agencies and even independent regulatory agencies all owe their existence to statutes passed by Congress. We have a separation of powers. That's another thing that makes us different, not just the federalist structure, but we're not a Westminster parliamentary form of government. We have this separation of powers between Congress, the president, and the judiciary, and particularly this distinction between Congress and the president, and the Congress and the executive branch is important because Congress has to pass a statute to establish an agency, to give it powers, and to give it specifically powers of regulation. When that happens, agencies then can actually create their own regulations that have the force of law, similar to what Congress might pass by statute. Someone can go to jail for violating a regulation that was adopted by a federal regulatory agency in certain circumstances. I mean, it's that equivalent. And there's a whole process and procedure for which agencies need to follow to adopt those kind of regulations.
And this kind of already now comes to the heart of what's happening in currently in the United States, because you've obviously got a new administration there under President Trump, and he's moving very fast in many, many ways. And obviously, we could talk a lot about some of the decisions that he and his administration have made over the last month and a half. I think it's only been that he's been in power. Yeah. But let's just focus on the regulatory stuff, because I understand that President Trump and his appointees have dismissed some independent inspectors general. There's talk about putting regulations in the woodchopper, moving fast to deregulate. And I know that you've spoken elsewhere about the importance of regulatory organizations of various kinds having autonomy to be able to make the kind of decisions that they make about applying the law fairly and consistently. So just give us a flavor. Obviously, it's early days now, but a flavor of what you think the new administration is doing in the domain of regulation.
Well, there's going to be a lot that they're not doing, first of all. So, we're not going to have new regulations on a lot of areas that might have arisen otherwise, artificial intelligence, climate change, and so forth. So, there's going to be a halting, and there is a halting of new regulations. We can talk more about the peeling off of regulations, the deregulating, and there's an executive order that's been adopted by the president that says that agencies can only adopt a new regulation when they identify 10 existing regulations for rescission.
Okay.
So,
that's a lot.
It's wildly out of proportion with any of the other one in, X out,
which we've had here in the UK as well. Yeah.
Right. Which you've had, but not at the 1 in 10 out.
Not
so it's
1 in
taking
10,
it to the extreme. But I think beyond that, as you indicated, there's efforts to really bring these independent regulatory agencies, which are multi-member commissions like our Federal Communications Commissions, our Federal Trade Commission, even our Federal Reserve Board in its banking regulatory capacity, to come under White House supervision, just like any other executive agency. That's something that there's also some Supreme Court action that might need to be taken to see how well the president can really bring them under his control. But that's going on. Also, and then I think the most important thing probably immediately is just that we're seeing a hiring freeze and efforts to really eliminate and reduce in force by the thousands of federal civil servants from regulatory agencies. Have to keep this in context that our federal civil service has not really changed a whole lot in size since back when John F. Kennedy was president in the 1960s. Despite our growth in population, despite all of the new regulatory challenges and the like that have arisen, federal civil service has remained largely the same. Now, we've had a large growth in outsourcing to federal contractors and the like, but these cuts are being made and not in a way that's really being done in any systematic or even thoughtful way about identifying priorities or the like, just to cut. And there's no way you could have done it in just 6 weeks to really identify where we should do it. But that could, have a very meaningful impact on the functioning day-to-day of various regulatory agencies.
So that's a kind of that's a risk in terms of, as you say, the functioning of regulatory agencies, their ability to make decisions, and obviously any organization where there are cuts being made, the staff in those organizations are looking over their shoulder and worrying about their jobs rather than getting on with their jobs. So there's inevitably going to be some hiatus in the ability of those organizations to perform their jobs effectively whilst they're worrying about all of this kind of structural stuff. So do you sense that this is an early kind of signal that's being given to regulatory organizations, or is there some kind of vision for a smaller regulatory model that might be applied in the United States?
Well, I think there's a vision of breaking things and disrupting existing patterns and hoping. I think it's really largely just hoping that out of this more disruptive process, something better will emerge, something leaner. That's certainly, I think, part of the strategy. But there isn't really much attention right now to smarter. We could do leaner, but we also need to be smarter. And, our executive orders on regulation are focused on just the one side of the equation of cost reduction without even recognizing in that executive order that President Trump adopted on the 1 in 10 out regulations, for example, has no mention of the possibility that regulations offer any benefits and that, eliminating some regulations might lead to eliminating those benefits, right? I mean, we have to think about regulation in a smart way, balancing both benefits and costs. And, there have been certainly instances in the past where regulators have gone in the United States have gone too far to the extreme in ignoring costs. But, now we're at the point where we just aren't even seeing our administration recognize benefits from regulation. And that's troubling. I mean, it's troubling because we've seen just in almost the same 6 weeks or so that President Trump's been in office, some major aviation accidents, for example, near misses that have happened so in the area of aviation safety and regulation, it doesn't make sense to see the Federal Aviation Administration having a loss of personnel just going after a certain percentage cut. I mean, we need to rethink, like, where do we have people deployed? And I think most people will say, for example, that our air traffic controllers tend to be overworked, and so we shouldn't be cutting those. But there may be other areas where we do have excess, right? But we need a process to really sort that out and to think that through. And we're not seeing that right now.
And it comes back to what you said right at the beginning about the asymmetry between the different functions of the regulators, where on the one hand, if everything's going well, nobody notices. Planes stay in the air. Everybody assumes they're always going to stay in the air. But as soon as you have an accident, whether it's in a hospital or obviously in an airport or wherever it happens to be, suddenly people think, well, hang on, how did we allow this to happen? And then the eye looks at the regulator for a remedy, and that's the longer term risk, obviously.
Right. It was with some bit of irony, I thought, that I heard Elon Musk, who's sort of spearheading a lot of this, slash and burn, wood chipper kind of approach to force reductions across the federal government. He was giving remarks at a recent cabinet meeting held by President Trump, and he apologized and said, we're going to have some mistakes that get made. We've eliminated, for example, funding for Ebola prevention. And he said, when we realized we did that, we put that back, because of course we all recognize we want to prevent Ebola from spreading. But what I thought was funny, without, I think, any degree of self-awareness, was that, we have mistakes that happen with government and our regular order too. And, yes, it might be the case that we have some fat that we could trim, some ways we could be organizing administrative and regulatory processes to be better than they are right now. And yes, there will be some mistakes that government makes, but that's sort of par for the course with government. What we want to do is try to do better than that, and not just come forward and slash and burn and then say, well, I might make mistakes. And the other thing that's interesting too is, we said, well, of course, we all want to have Ebola protection, and I think that's absolutely true. But we also all want, maybe, or maybe not all of us, but a majority want, through legislative processes, to have other programs that this White House has decided on its own are no longer going to exist or thrive, and so forth. And that's why we have a government, really, to have a process for figuring out all of these questions about what a nation wants.
And that's the great thing about democracy, isn't it? That you have these debates so that society together can come to conclusions about, how we want to rub along together, which is, it's never easy. And regulators, I know, are having to make these judgments a lot in complex areas where you can't have everybody winning, unfortunately.
Right. Exactly.
And one of the things that Grania in New Zealand was talking about was regulatory systems, where she was keen to make sure that New Zealand's regulatory systems, just touching on the point that you just made in the United States, they do reduce the number of regulations, they make things less burdensome, but they do it in a measured and holistic way to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences along the way. And it sounds like that's a risk that you're articulating in the United States at the moment. That's not going to happen.
I don't see that we're moving forward on a path where that will be happening. Certainly, again, with certainly the workforce issues, that's not happening. We have, by the way, an executive order that once the hiring freeze is lifted across the whole federal government, there will be a process of 1 in and 4 out with respect to employees. And, one just really has to think about how we handle those decisions in a thoughtful manner, and not just what we've been seeing is targeting, for example, the easy ways to get rid of people in these agencies. For example, anybody who's on a probationary period, who's just been in the government for a year or so, can easily be fired. They don't have the civil service protection. So they just fired essentially all of those, or predominantly all of those. That's where you have to say, well, maybe some of those folks are really, really important, like new people to be air traffic controllers, or new people coming on board to protect our nuclear reactors and their safety, and so
Sure.
forth.
Goodness. Well, this is a risky strategy, as we've just been highlighting, and sometimes, obviously, these risky strategies have short-term costs in turbulence, but there is a kind of a benefit over the longer term. So, if you were in a position to be listened to, you're extremely influential already. But if there were people in the White House and in Congress who were taking your advice on how to get to that leaner regulatory model, what kinds of things would you be saying to them?
Well, some of the things that have been adopted in past administrations, I think we could do more of. A retrospective review, it was not really pursued with much vigor in the last administration, and I think that's very important. We do have institutionalized processes in the United States, and we have had those in place for, since the Reagan administration, for looking before we regulate it, looking before we leap, if you will, and analyzing regulations ex ante. So we do have a process for regulatory impact analysis or regulatory impact assessment. But, there's a lot that can happen after a regulation is put in place. They may not work as intended. And I've always advocated that we institutionalize processes for retrospective review. And those processes have largely been ad hoc from administration to administration. They haven't generally been very systematic or rigorous. I think we could do much better by institutionalizing a retrospective review of regulations. But these take some time, and it's not an approach that's I guess going to be perceived by anybody in the current president's base, for example, electoral base, is easy to see. So, maybe that's why we have these highly visible, but perhaps less sensible strategies being deployed.
Well, goodness me, it puts partly the onus on those of us who work in regulation to put our own house in order so that we can demonstrate to people who do challenge a particular regulatory system that it is efficient, that we have found ways to get rid of onerous burdens that are being imposed on whichever group it might be, that we're moving with the times. So maybe there are things that we can do to make sure that we are robust and effective in the way that we regulate. And obviously, that's one of the things that we're trying to do here in the Institute of Regulation. I know you're trying to do that in the Penn Program in Pennsylvania as well. So just in the last couple of minutes, let's try and help our listeners to find the best ways to keep up to date with regulatory developments, to improve their knowledge, to share learning. What would you be recommending to people who are wanting to improve the way that they regulate in their own sectors?
Well, self-interestedly, I guess, or shameless promotion here would be to take a look at our regulatory review. We're putting out new content every day. We have a newsletter you can subscribe to. We have a newsletter also for our Penn Program on Regulation that comes out every month, so you can keep tabs on that. We do have executive education courses. I think the most important thing really is to remember what we're all about in the world of regulation, though. I mean, I think regulators can often get caught up in the kind of the minutia of day-to-day, the complexities of day-to-day, and sort of forget what it's all about. I like to say that, regulation is about people ultimately, and not necessarily about rules and rule books and systems and all of that. And if we keep people at the front and center of what we're doing, people who are going to benefit from regulations, and people who are certainly going to bear the costs of regulation. Sometimes the latter people are more vocal and more visible to regulators. But I think you need to think about it. I've talked with, for example, financial regulators, and I asked them, why do you do what you do? And they kind of struggle with that a little bit. And they might say things like, ultimately to, keep protect the safety and soundness of banks, which absolutely they should be doing. But then I push them a little further. But why? And I urge them to think about the families in your jurisdiction who are working hard. The parents are working to save for their children's future, their education, to put meals on the table or whatever. And what will happen to them if banks collapse, if they don't have their retirement savings protected? These are the real consequences of regulation, and keeping those front and center, foremost in mind, I think, is the most important thing that regulators around the world can, need to, as a first principle, keep in mind.
Absolutely. My goodness me, what a fantastic way to end. Completely agree with that. Those of us who work in regulation, we need to think not just about the small group that we regulate, but about those people who we're regulating for and on behalf of, whether they're taxpayers, service users, consumers, or just citizens, as we all are, of a country that we want to be safe and that we can trust the services to be delivered when we need them, and not to be have to deal with cowboys who are trying to rob us because there's a regulator that's in place to make sure that we're safe. So fantastic. Goodness me, Cary, we could carry on, I know, talking about all these kinds of things. And I do urge everybody listening to check out the Penn Program of Regulation and the Regulatory Review. I'm really, really grateful to you, Cary, for joining us. Lots of learning for us there. So Professor Cary Coglianese of the University of Pennsylvania, do have a look at his Penn program. Thanks also to our sound engineer, Neil Bowerman from Bowerman Audio Productions. And for those of you listening, thank you. And I hope you found the discussion interesting. Do let your colleagues know about it and share the link. Tune into future podcasts where we'll be discussing other issues of interest to regulators. There's other material and events on the Institute of Regulation's website, ioregulation.org. That's all for now from me, Marcial Boo, at the Regulation Podcast. Good luck with your own regulatory challenges, and do stay in touch with each other and with the Institute. Goodbye.